Our HOA president decides my door is the wrong shade of blue and demands $500. Can you believe that? $500 for paint color. When I tell her no way, she calls the police on us. I'm thinking this woman has seriously lost it until two patrol cars actually show up at my house. But here's where it gets weird. The officer checks my wife's ID, and suddenly he's treating her completely differently, like she's someone special or something. I keep looking at her, thinking, do I really know my wife as well as I thought I did? What's the craziest thing you've discovered about someone close to you? Drop it in the comments. You guys, I still can't believe what happened at my house last Tuesday. I mean, I've heard horror stories about HOA Karens before, but I never thought I'd be living one myself. So, there I was, just trying to enjoy my morning coffee, when this sharp knock echoed through our front door. Not the friendly neighbor kind of knock, but that official, businesslike rap that immediately puts you on edge. I peek through the window and see this woman standing there with what looks like a legal portfolio and a measuring tape. A freaking measuring tape. I should have known right then that my peaceful suburban life was about to get turned upside down. Her name was Nancy Moore, and she introduced herself as the HOA president with the kind of professional authority that would make a corporate lawyer jealous. She wasn't some crazy lady in pajamas screaming about property values. No, this woman was calculated, organized, and frankly, that made her way scarier. She had laminated documents, certified mail receipts, and photographs that were time-stamped and organized in plastic sleeves. "Mr. Simmons," she said, handing me a thick envelope, "your property is in violation of community standards regarding exterior door paint compliance. The fine is $500, payable within 48 hours. $500 for paint." I'm looking at our front door thinking, what's wrong with blue? It's nice, blue, oceany, calming. Apparently, according to Nancy's March 2024 Community Standards Update, it should have been navy blue, not this non-compliant maritime azure. Here's where it gets interesting, though. See, my wife Rebecca had been inside, but she must have heard the conversation because she appeared behind me with this expression I'd never seen before. Calm? Yes, but there was something else there. Something that made Nancy's confident demeanor flicker for just a second. "We'll need to review the complete HOA financial audit before any payment is made," Rebecca said. Not as a request, but as a statement of fact. Nancy blinked, clearly not expecting this response. "This is just a violation fine, Mrs. Simmons. It's standard procedure," but Rebecca wasn't backing down. "I don't participate in financial systems I haven't personally verified." The way she said it, with this quiet authority, made me wonder when my wife had become such an expert on financial compliance. I mean, she worked for the city in some planning capacity, but this sounded way more sophisticated than zoning permits. Nancy tried to maintain her professional composure, but I could see the wheels turning. "Ma'am, this is a simple matter of community standards enforcement. The fine structure is clearly outlined in the homeowner agreement you signed." Rebecca just smiled, the kind of smile that somehow managed to be polite and terrifying at the same time. "Then you won't mind providing complete documentation of how fines are assessed, collected, and allocated within the community budget." The silence stretched between them like a loaded spring. Nancy's measuring tape suddenly seemed less intimidating when faced with Rebecca's unshakable confidence. "Your wife seems unusually well-versed in legal procedures for a homeowner," Nancy finally said, and there was something in her tone that made my skin crawl. Not admiration, but calculation. Like she was filing this information away for later use. The whole interaction lasted maybe 15 minutes, but it felt like watching two chess masters size each other up before the first move. Nancy eventually left, but not before making it clear that non-compliance would result in escalated legal action. As soon as her car pulled away, Rebecca was on her phone, speaking in that same authoritative tone I'd just witnessed. "I need you to research Nancy Moore. Look for any patterns of financial irregularities or fraud indicators." She was asking someone to investigate our HOA president. When she hung up, I had to ask the obvious question. Who was that? How can you just request background investigations? Rebecca paused, studying my face like she was deciding how much to tell me. "Just a consultation, honey. Sometimes it pays to understand who you're dealing with." But the way she said it, with that same quiet confidence she'd shown Nancy, made me realize something profound about my wife of 3 years. As I'm standing there processing what just happened, I start thinking about all the little things I'd noticed, but never really questioned. The way Rebecca always seemed to know exactly what to do in complicated situations. How she never seemed intimidated by authority figures. The fact that she always parked in the driveway, never the garage, like she might need to leave quickly. Her city planning job that somehow required her to work odd hours and make mysterious phone calls. I'd always assumed she was just really good at her job. But what if there was more to it? What if the woman I married had layers I was only just beginning to discover? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying, because if Rebecca was more than she appeared, what did that mean for everything I thought I knew about our life together? Rebecca quietly ended her call and turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before. Part determination, part something else I couldn't identify. "That was just a consultation," she said, but her voice carried an authority that made me wonder, who exactly did I marry? Okay, so I thought Nancy would back down after Rebecca's power move, but I seriously underestimated this woman's commitment to being professionally vindictive. 3 days later, I'm editing a work presentation when I hear cars pulling up outside. Not just any cars, police cars. 2 of them. My stomach drops because, honestly, when you see cops at your door, your mind immediately goes to worst-case scenarios. Did something happen to a family member? Is there some emergency in the neighborhood? But then I see Nancy walking up behind the officers, and everything clicks into place. This calculated woman actually called the police on us for refusing to pay her ridiculous fine. The officers introduced themselves as responding to a property dispute with potential harassment via social media. Nancy had printed out screenshots of my social media posts about the HOA situation, organized them in a folder with timestamps, and presented them like evidence in a criminal trial. She wasn't just complaining to the police, she was building a case. "Officers, I'm concerned about escalation and need official documentation for potential court proceedings," she explained, with the kind of professional tone that makes you sound reasonable even when you're being completely ridiculous. One of the officers, whose nameplate read Carter, reviewed her documentation with the thoroughness of someone who'd clearly dealt with HOA disputes before. The other officer took notes while Nancy explained how our refusal to comply with community standards had created a hostile environment for law-abiding homeowners. When Officer Carter asked to speak with Rebecca, she came outside with that same calm confidence from the other day. She answered his questions about the violation notice, our response, and my social media posts with the kind of measured professionalism you would expect from someone who dealt with legal procedures regularly. Nothing seemed unusual until Carter asked for her driver's license. It was such a routine request that I almost didn't pay attention, but then something shifted in the dynamic. Carter looked at Rebecca's ID, paused, read it again more carefully, then stepped aside to make a radio call. "Control, can you run a background verification on Rebecca Simmons?" he said quietly into his radio, but I caught enough to hear him rattling off what sounded like a badge number or identification code. When Carter returned from his radio call, his entire demeanor had changed. The casual, routine interaction suddenly became formal and respectful. "Ma'am, thank you for your cooperation in this matter," he said to Rebecca, with a tone that was markedly different from how he'd addressed Nancy or me. He explained to Nancy that this appeared to be a civil matter requiring mediation, not criminal intervention, and that social media posts documenting HOA interactions didn't constitute harassment unless they contained specific threats. Nancy's professional composure cracked just slightly. "But they're refusing to comply with community standards," she insisted. "That's a civil matter for HOA mediation or small claims court," Carter replied firmly. "We can't enforce homeowner association violations unless there's evidence of actual criminal activity." The whole time this was happening, I was watching Nancy watch Rebecca, and I could see her calculating something. After the officers checked both our identification documents, treated us with standard politeness, and explained the proper channels for HOA disputes, Nancy wasn't satisfied. She'd expected them to side with her, maybe even cite us for something, but instead they'd treated Rebecca with what seemed like professional courtesy. As the officers prepared to leave, Carter addressed Rebecca one more time. "Ma'am, we appreciate your cooperation. If you have any further issues with harassment, don't hesitate to contact us." Not us, plural, her, specifically. Nancy caught that too, and I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. After the police left, Nancy lingered by her car, watching our house like she was trying to solve a puzzle. That's when I noticed Rebecca's phone buzz with a text message. She glanced at it, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker across her face. Recognition, maybe relief. The text was brief, but I caught a glimpse of it over her shoulder. Saw the patrol cars. Situation handled. It was from an unknown number, but Rebecca's reaction suggested she knew exactly who it was from. She typed back quickly, then slipped the phone into her pocket. "Everything okay?" I asked, because, honestly, getting reassuring texts about police visits seemed like the kind of thing that required explanation. "Just a neighbor checking in," she said, but her voice had that same careful quality from when she had deflected my questions about her mysterious phone call earlier. After the police left, Nancy didn't go straight home. Instead, she made a phone call right there on the sidewalk, and I could hear fragments of her conversation. "I need a background investigation on Rebecca Simmons," she was saying. "Professional level, not just social media checking. Something's not right about this woman." Within an hour, a man in a cheap suit was knocking on doors in our neighborhood, introducing himself as Tommy, a private investigator hired for community safety research. The speed with which Nancy had mobilized professional help told me this wasn't just neighborhood drama anymore. This was warfare. Most people would be stressed about having police called to their house over an HOA dispute, but Rebecca had handled it like just another Tuesday. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit, because it suggested a level of experience with law enforcement situations that didn't match anything I knew about my wife's background. Nancy watched from her window as the text lit up Rebecca's phone. Rebecca read it, and for just a moment, Nancy saw something flicker across her face. Recognition, maybe relief. Nancy's blood ran cold as one question burned in her mind. What kind of person gets reassuring texts about police visits? 2 weeks after Nancy hired Tommy, the private investigator returned with findings that made Nancy's professional confidence crack for the first time since this whole situation began. Tommy arrived at her house looking genuinely unsettled, clutching his report like it contained information he wished he'd never discovered. "Ma'am, I've been doing background investigations for 15 years, and I've never encountered anything like this," he said, his voice carrying the kind of nervous tension that comes from realizing you might be in over your head. Rebecca Simmons's employment history is sealed by court order. Her vehicle registration shows government fleet ownership. Most concerning, there are no public records for anyone matching her description prior to 2019. Nancy studied Tommy's report with growing alarm, her carefully constructed narrative about Rebecca being a problem resident crumbling as she faced evidence suggesting something far more serious was happening. The documents showed that Rebecca's background check had hit multiple walls of official classification and restricted access that Tommy had never encountered when investigating ordinary civilians. "What kind of person has employment records sealed by court order?" Nancy asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. Tommy's response confirmed her worst fears. "In my experience, only 3 types of people get this level of protection: federal witnesses, undercover law enforcement, or intelligence operatives." While Nancy was processing the implications of Tommy's discoveries, Rebecca had been conducting her own systematic investigation into Nancy's operations with the methodical thoroughness of someone trained in fraud detection and evidence collection. She had obtained copies of every violation notice issued by the HOA over the past 3 years, cross-referenced them with actual community bylaws, and documented a pattern of systematic abuse that went far beyond arbitrary enforcement. When Rebecca showed me spreadsheets tracking violation patterns against homeowner demographics, I realized this wasn't casual research motivated by personal grievance. This was professional investigative methodology that required expertise in data analysis and criminal pattern recognition. Rebecca's financial analysis revealed disturbing correlations that painted Nancy's activities as a sophisticated criminal enterprise rather than overzealous community management. Elderly residents were 5 times more likely to receive expensive violation notices than younger homeowners. Recent immigrants face systematic targeting for violations that longtime residents could commit without consequence. Single-parent households received threats of legal action at rates that suggested deliberate exploitation of vulnerable populations. The data showed that Nancy wasn't enforcing community standards. She was running a predatory scheme designed to extract money from people least equipped to resist or seek legal recourse. The scope of Nancy's systematic fraud became clear when Rebecca compiled financial records showing the relationship between HOA violations and payments to More Property Solutions. Over $127,000 had been transferred from homeowners to Nancy's private business over 3 years, with payments consistently following violation notices by 2 to 3 weeks. The correlation was so precise that it constituted documentary evidence of organized financial fraud rather than coincidental business relationships. Rebecca had essentially built a prosecution-ready case file that demonstrated systematic criminal activity with the kind of thoroughness that suggested extensive experience in white-collar crime investigation. Tommy's investigation into Rebecca's background had inadvertently triggered official attention that Nancy was completely unprepared to handle. When private investigators start probing government-protected identities, those inquiries generate alerts within law enforcement databases that flag potential security breaches or attempts to compromise official operations. Within days of Tommy's background check, Rebecca received notification that her operational security had been compromised and that countermeasures were being implemented to protect both her identity and the integrity of her ongoing investigation into HOA fraud across multiple jurisdictions. Nancy's realization that she might be facing someone with official law enforcement authority sent her into strategic panic mode, but her response demonstrated the same calculated intelligence that had enabled her fraud scheme to operate successfully for years. Instead of backing down or attempting to negotiate, Nancy decided to escalate the conflict by positioning herself as the victim of government harassment and illegal surveillance. She began documenting every interaction with Rebecca, recording phone calls, and building a narrative that portrayed herself as a dedicated community volunteer, being persecuted by corrupt law enforcement officials who were abusing their authority to intimidate honest citizens. Rebecca's expertise in fraud investigation had enabled her to identify not just the scope of Nancy's financial crimes, but also the psychological manipulation tactics used to maintain victim compliance. Nancy had created an environment of fear where questioning HOA decisions was characterized as anti-community behavior that threatened everyone's property values. Residents who couldn't afford to pay fabricated fines were told they were selfish neighbors who didn't care about community standards. Elderly homeowners were convinced that minor violations could result in foreclosure and homelessness. The systematic psychological abuse was as sophisticated as the financial fraud and required an intimate understanding of community dynamics and individual vulnerabilities. The expansion of Rebecca's investigation beyond our neighborhood revealed that Nancy's scheme was part of a broader pattern of HOA corruption that affected multiple communities across the county. More Property Solutions had similar arrangements with 3 other community associations, systematically extracting money from homeowners through fabricated compliance requirements and emergency assessments. The total scope of the fraud exceeded $380,000, with victims including dozens of families who'd been forced to choose between paying for non-existent violations or facing threats of legal action they couldn't afford to contest. Nancy's strategic response to learning about Rebecca's protected background involved attempting to turn the community against her by characterizing the government investigation as a violation of residents' privacy and constitutional rights. She began circulating information about Rebecca's sealed employment records, suggesting that law enforcement surveillance of ordinary homeowners represented dangerous overreach that threatened everyone's freedom and security. Nancy was essentially trying to transform her own criminal prosecution into a civil liberties issue that would generate community support for her position as defender of residents' rights against government intrusion. Rebecca's professional handling of Nancy's counterattack demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that comes from extensive experience with sophisticated criminals who attempt to manipulate public opinion and legal procedures to avoid accountability. Rather than engaging in public arguments about government authority or investigation procedures, Rebecca focused on ensuring that victim testimony and financial evidence were properly documented and preserved, according to legal standards that would withstand court challenges. She coordinated with Mrs. Parker and other victims to organize their documentation, while maintaining operational security that prevented Nancy from destroying evidence or intimidating witnesses. The psychological dynamics between Nancy and Rebecca had evolved into a complex chess match between criminal intelligence and law enforcement expertise, with each woman recognizing that the other represented a level of strategic sophistication that demanded careful planning and flawless execution. Nancy understood that she was facing someone with official authority and professional training in fraud investigation. Rebecca recognized that Nancy was a calculating criminal who would exploit any procedural errors or evidence gaps to escape prosecution. The stakes had escalated far beyond neighborhood drama into a high-level conflict between organized crime and professional law enforcement. Nancy's attempts to gather intelligence about Rebecca's official role and investigation scope led her to make contacts within local government and law enforcement that ultimately provided additional evidence of her willingness to obstruct justice and tamper with official proceedings. Her inquiries about Rebecca's employment status and case authority created documented evidence of attempts to interfere with ongoing criminal investigations. Every move Nancy made to protect herself from prosecution actually strengthened the case against her by demonstrating consciousness of guilt and systematic efforts to evade accountability through manipulation and obstruction. Tommy handed Nancy the PI report with shaking hands. "Ma'am, I've never seen anything like this. Her entire identity. It's like she appeared out of thin air 5 years ago." Nancy stared at the government vehicle registration, her mouth going dry as one terrifying possibility hit her. What if Rebecca isn't the one being investigated? Drop a comment below. Have you ever discovered something about a neighbor that completely changed how you saw them? Share your story. Nancy called an emergency HOA meeting for Thursday evening, and what happened that night was like watching a master manipulator finally meet her match in front of an audience that was ready for the truth. Word about Nancy's escalating harassment campaign had spread throughout the neighborhood, bringing out residents who hadn't attended community meetings in years. The community center was packed beyond capacity, with people bringing folding chairs from home and others standing along the walls. This wasn't just curiosity about neighborhood drama. This was a community that had finally reached its breaking point with systematic intimidation and was ready to demand accountability. Nancy had prepared for this moment like a prosecutor presenting a case for conviction. She'd created a professional PowerPoint presentation titled "Community Security and Hidden Criminal Elements," complete with printed handouts, evidence folders, and a laptop connected to the projection system. This wasn't some desperate last-ditch effort. This was a calculated media presentation designed to destroy Rebecca's credibility and justify Nancy's increasingly aggressive enforcement actions. "Neighbors," she began with the commanding presence of someone accustomed to absolute authority, "we face unprecedented threats to our community's safety and property values. Tonight, we address the systematic harassment and possible criminal infiltration that endangers everything we've worked to build here." I started live streaming the meeting on my phone, partly because the situation had become so surreal that I wanted documentation, and partly because I had a feeling Nancy was about to overplay her hand in spectacular fashion. Within minutes, I had over 2,500 viewers, with comments rolling in faster than I could read them. People were sharing the stream, tagging friends, and asking questions about what was happening in our suburban neighborhood that required an emergency community meeting with PowerPoint presentations and evidence folders. The viewer count kept climbing as Nancy launched into her presentation, displaying screenshots of my social media posts, photos of our house, and a timeline of what she characterized as escalating anti-community behaviors and harassment tactics. 15 minutes into Nancy's presentation, technology delivered justice in the most spectacular way imaginable. She was advancing through slides about identifying suspicious behavioral patterns in community infiltrators when her laptop began responding sluggishly to commands. Nancy started clicking frantically, trying to advance to the next slide, but the computer seemed to be freezing up. In her growing panic, she pressed multiple keys simultaneously and accidentally triggered a desktop screen share that displayed her computer's file directory instead of the PowerPoint presentation. Suddenly, projected on the wall for everyone to see was Nancy's recently opened Documents folder, prominently featuring an Excel file labeled More Property Solutions, Client Database, Confidential. The room fell into stunned silence as people processed what they were seeing. Nancy's personal business files were displayed on the community center's projection screen, showing spreadsheet names that clearly indicated financial arrangements between homeowners and her private company. For nearly 30 seconds, while Nancy desperately tried to regain control of her presentation, the entire room could see documentary evidence of what appeared to be systematic financial relationships between HOA violations and payments to Nancy's business. My live stream viewers were going absolutely insane in the comments, with people screaming to screenshot everything and demanding explanations for what they were witnessing. Nancy's face went pale as she realized the magnitude of her technological disaster, but the damage was irreversible. Even after she managed to close the desktop view and return to her PowerPoint, the energy in the room had completely transformed. Instead of concerned neighbors listening to warnings about community security threats, we now had a crowd of people who just witnessed what looked like evidence of systematic financial fraud projected on the wall by the person making accusations against others. The murmurs and whispered conversations were building to an audible buzz as people tried to process the implications of what they'd seen. Mrs. Parker chose that moment to demonstrate the kind of courage that transforms communities. This elderly woman, who'd been terrorized into paying $3,000 for fabricated violations, slowly stood up and addressed the room with a voice that carried surprising strength and moral authority. "I paid Nancy $3,000 last year for violations that never existed," she announced, her words cutting through the confused chatter like a blade. "She told me my garden trellis was a structural safety hazard and threatened to place a lien on my house if I didn't pay her company immediately for emergency corrections." The silence that followed was profound and electric, as neighbors realized they were hearing testimony about criminal fraud, not community policy disputes. Mrs. Parker's brave testimony opened floodgates of similar revelations that completely demolished Nancy's credibility and exposed the scope of her systematic exploitation. The family across the street revealed they'd paid $2,000 for emergency mailbox compliance to avoid threatened legal action. Another neighbor disclosed $5,000 in landscaping violation fees for bushes that were supposedly endangering community safety standards. Person after person stood up with stories of excessive fines, threats of foreclosure, and payments to Nancy's mysteriously official-sounding business for corrections that either never happened or weren't actually required by legitimate HOA regulations. The total amount of money involved was staggering and represented a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been operating under the cover of community governance for years. We were talking about over $127,000 extracted from families in our small neighborhood alone, with victims who'd been too intimidated or isolated to realize they were part of a broader pattern of systematic fraud. Nancy had targeted the most vulnerable residents: elderly homeowners, recent immigrants, single parents who couldn't afford legal representation, and used their fears of foreclosure and legal action to extort money for her personal business. Rebecca's response to this community revelation was masterful in its restraint and strategic timing. Rather than immediately attacking Nancy or making accusations, she stood up and addressed the crowd with the kind of professional authority that commanded immediate attention and respect. "Since financial irregularities have been disclosed tonight," she said calmly, "I believe it's appropriate to invoke Civil Code Section 1365.2.5, which requires HOA boards to provide complete financial transparency to homeowners upon written request." She then proceeded to explain, in clear and accessible language, the legal requirements for HOA financial accountability, the proper procedures for fine assessment and collection, and the criminal implications of diverting community funds to personal business ventures. Nancy's attempts to regain control of the meeting and her narrative became increasingly desperate and counterproductive as Rebecca systematically dismantled the legal foundation of her entire operation. When Nancy claimed that homeowners had no right to demand financial records, Rebecca cited specific statutory requirements for transparency. When Nancy insisted that her business arrangements were standard industry practice, Rebecca explained the legal definitions of fraud and embezzlement. When Nancy threatened to sue everyone for defamation, Rebecca calmly noted that truth is an absolute defense against defamation claims, and that documented financial transactions constitute factual evidence rather than opinion. The meeting devolved into chaos as Nancy realized she'd completely lost control of both the narrative and the crowd. She began making increasingly wild accusations about criminal conspiracies and harassment campaigns, while simultaneously trying to justify financial arrangements that she'd just finished denying existed. Her credibility collapsed entirely when she started claiming that payments to More Property Solutions were voluntary community improvement contributions, while also insisting that the financial records people had seen were fabricated evidence. You can't simultaneously argue that something didn't happen and that it was perfectly legal when it did happen. My live stream audience had grown to over 15,000 viewers by the time Nancy's presentation completely imploded, with people from around the country watching a real-time demonstration of how community corruption gets exposed. The comments were a mixture of outrage at Nancy's systematic exploitation of vulnerable residents and amazement at Rebecca's professional dismantling of the entire fraudulent operation. Local news outlets started monitoring the stream as clips went viral, And by morning, our neighborhood HOA drama had become a national example of how social media documentation can expose corruption that might otherwise remain hidden. As County Fraud Division vehicles pulled up outside More Property Solutions, Nancy's phone buzzed with an unknown number. Her hands trembled as she read the text. "We need to talk. Tonight. Come alone." She looked across the street at Rebecca, who was calmly watering her garden, and Nancy's world tilted as she realized, has this entire neighborhood been one giant trap? The morning after the community meeting, I woke up to an empty bed and the sound of Rebecca moving around our bedroom with the kind of focused efficiency that suggested she'd been awake for hours. When I tried to discuss the previous night's revelations about Nancy's financial fraud and Rebecca's obvious expertise in handling the situation, she deflected with professional language about letting appropriate investigative channels handle documented evidence, and insisted our role was simply to provide accurate information if requested by authorities. But I'd watched her coordinate that room full of angry neighbors, like someone accustomed to managing complex crisis situations, and I'd heard her make that phone call to what sounded like law enforcement officials who knew exactly who she was. "Rebecca," I said, positioning myself between her and the bedroom door, "I need you to stop deflecting and tell me what's really happening here. Your knowledge of legal procedures, your ability to cite specific civil codes from memory, that phone call to people who clearly know your professional background, none of this aligns with city planning work." She paused in her methodical preparation for another mysteriously early departure, studying my face with an expression that seemed to be calculating how much truth she could safely reveal. "Dylan, there are aspects of my work that involve sensitive regulatory oversight. I can't discuss operational details, but everything I'm doing is necessary and completely legal." That careful non-answer, delivered with the practiced ambiguity of someone who'd evaded direct questions many times before, finally pushed me past the point of accepting Rebecca's professional secrecy. What kind of regulatory oversight requires you to have direct contact with fraud investigators? What kind of city planning job gives you the authority to coordinate evidence collection from crime victims? My voice was rising despite my efforts to stay calm, because the gap between what Rebecca claimed to do for work and what I'd witnessed her actually doing had become impossible to ignore. She acknowledged that her position involved compliance monitoring and irregularity detection, but refused to explain why she couldn't discuss these responsibilities with her own husband. The argument that followed was unlike anything we'd experienced in 3 years of marriage, not because we were shouting at each other, but because of the clinical way Rebecca continued evading every direct question about her identity and professional authority. When I asked specifically if she was a police officer, federal agent, or investigator of some kind, she responded with variations of, "I work in fraud, prevention, and regulatory compliance," which was technically an answer that provided zero useful information. The more I pressed for clarity, the more obvious it became that Rebecca had extensive training in deflecting interrogation while appearing cooperative and transparent. What hurt most wasn't the evasion itself, but the growing realization that our entire relationship might be built on fundamental deceptions about who Rebecca was and why she'd chosen to live in our neighborhood. How many of our casual conversations about community issues had actually been Rebecca gathering intelligence for an active investigation? When she'd ask questions about HOA policies or neighbor relationships, had she been making conversation or collecting evidence? The woman I'd married was either an exceptional liar or someone whose professional life required such complete compartmentalization that even her spouse couldn't be trusted with basic information about her work. 2 days after our confrontation, I did something that felt like violating our marriage but seemed necessary for my own sanity. I called Rebecca's office to verify her employment status and job description. After being transferred between multiple departments for nearly 30 minutes, I finally spoke with someone who confirmed that Rebecca Simmons was affiliated with municipal oversight functions, but couldn't provide specific details about her role due to confidentiality protocols that protect sensitive investigative work. Confidentiality protocols prevented them from discussing her job with her husband. That's when I knew with absolute certainty that Rebecca's work wasn't what she'd told me it was. The revelation that my wife's employment required the kind of operational security typically associated with law enforcement or intelligence work left me questioning everything I thought I knew about our life together. Had Rebecca moved to our neighborhood because she genuinely wanted to build a marriage with me, or because it provided strategic access for monitoring Nancy's activities? Were her feelings for me authentic, or was our relationship part of some elaborate professional cover? These questions consumed me because if Rebecca could maintain such complete deception about her professional identity, what else might she be hiding about her motivations and commitments? My crisis of trust deepened when neighbors started approaching me for information about Rebecca's background and qualifications to help them understand their legal options for dealing with Nancy's systematic harassment. Mrs. Parker wanted to know if Rebecca could recommend lawyers specializing in fraud recovery. Other victims were asking if my wife could explain the process for filing complaints with county authorities. Everyone assumed that because Rebecca clearly possessed expertise in financial crimes and regulatory violations, I must have insights into her professional credentials and connections. Instead, I found myself in the humiliating position of admitting that I didn't know what my own wife did for a living. 3 days into this emotional turmoil, Rebecca came home with news that fundamentally changed our situation. Her consulting contract with the county had been temporarily suspended pending an ethics review. There's a potential conflict of interest because I'm personally involved in the community being investigated, she explained, with the same careful professionalism she'd used throughout our marriage to discuss sensitive work matters. The county needs to ensure that my residential status here doesn't compromise the investigation's integrity or admissibility of evidence in court. For the first time since I'd known her, Rebecca seemed genuinely worried about professional consequences. The suspension meant that Rebecca faced the possibility of losing not just this case, but her entire consulting career if the ethics review determined her personal involvement had compromised investigative procedures. She'd spent months gathering evidence, coordinating with victims, and building a prosecution case that could be dismissed because she'd chosen to live in the community she was protecting. Watching her work frantically to preserve the investigation through official channels, ensuring that all evidence could be independently verified and victim testimonies properly documented, finally helped me understand the depth of her commitment to justice over personal advancement. During Rebecca's professional crisis, something shifted in my perspective on our relationship problems. Instead of feeling betrayed by her secrecy, I began recognizing the impossible position she'd been in, balancing legal requirements for operational security with personal desires for honest communication with her husband. She couldn't discuss active investigations, even with family members, couldn't reveal her true professional role without compromising evidence collection, and couldn't explain why her work required such extensive confidentiality without violating the very protocols designed to protect victims and ensure successful prosecutions. Rebecca's response to her suspension demonstrated character qualities I'd never fully appreciated during our marriage. Rather than prioritizing her own career protection, she focused entirely on ensuring that Nancy's victims would receive justice regardless of what happened to her professionally. She worked 18-hour days coordinating with Mrs. Parker and other families to preserve financial documentation, organize witness statements that could stand independently of her involvement, and collaborated with county investigators to maintain case integrity even if she was permanently removed from the investigation. The ethics review process took 2 weeks, during which Rebecca faced the possibility that everything she'd worked for would be destroyed by bureaucratic interpretations of conflict of interest policies. County investigators had to determine whether her residential connection to the case enhanced or compromised her effectiveness as a fraud consultant. Victim advocates argued that Rebecca's community involvement had enabled her to identify patterns of abuse that outside investigators might have missed. Legal experts debated whether her personal stake in the outcome strengthened or weakened her professional objectivity. When Rebecca's clearance was finally restored, with the ethics board determining that her residential status had actually enhanced rather than compromised the investigation, I felt relief that extended far beyond our personal relationship. The county's decision meant that Nancy's prosecution could proceed with all evidence intact, that victims would receive the justice they deserved, and that Rebecca's professional reputation remained untarnished by accusations of improper conduct. More importantly for our marriage, it meant that Rebecca's secrecy had been professionally necessary rather than personally motivated deception. The resolution of Rebecca's employment crisis marked the beginning of genuine healing in our relationship, but it also forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my own assumptions and expectations. I demanded transparency about work that legally couldn't be discussed, questioned motivations for secrecy that were professionally required, and interpreted necessary operational security as personal betrayal. Understanding the constraints Rebecca had been operating under helped me recognize that her choices had been shaped by professional obligations rather than personal distrust of our marriage. Dylan sat in the hotel room, staring at Mrs. Parker's financial documents spread across the bed. Every transaction, every forced payment, every family destroyed. The evidence was overwhelming, but as he reached for his phone to call Rebecca, one question stopped him cold. If she's been protecting everyone this whole time, what else has she been protecting him from? The morning of Nancy's arrest, I woke to find Rebecca already dressed in what looked like official attire: dark slacks, a professional blazer, and an expression of focused determination I'd rarely seen. She was coordinating with multiple agencies through a series of phone calls that revealed the scope of the operation about to unfold. County Fraud Division is executing warrants at 8 a.m., she told someone on the phone. Local police will provide arrest support, and victim advocates are standing by for witness interviews. This wasn't my wife helping with a neighborhood problem. This was a law enforcement professional coordinating a major criminal takedown that had been months in the planning. When the convoy of official vehicles arrived, our quiet suburban street transformed into something resembling a major crime scene. County fraud investigators, local police units, and what appeared to be federal agents systematically surrounded Nancy's house while executing simultaneous search warrants on more property solutions offices across town. Rebecca moved among the various law enforcement personnel with an authority that made it clear she wasn't just consulting on this case. She was leading significant aspects of the investigation. Neighbors gathered in yards and driveways, many live-streaming the dramatic culmination of an investigation that had been building for 8 months before any of us knew it existed. Nancy's emergence from her house in handcuffs was both anticlimactic and deeply satisfying. Even while being arrested, she maintained her victim persona, claiming that she was being persecuted for protecting community standards, and that real criminals were the residents who'd refused to comply with legitimate HOA procedures. Her complete inability to acknowledge wrongdoing, even when faced with overwhelming evidence and criminal charges, demonstrated the psychological profile of someone who'd convinced herself that exploitation was actually community service. She demanded to speak with her lawyer, insisted that all HOA activities had been completely legal, and threatened to sue everyone involved for harassment and defamation. The moment that changed everything happened when Lieutenant Morrison arrived to supervise the arrest operation. As the senior officer coordinating between multiple agencies, he surveyed the scene to ensure proper procedures were being followed and victims' rights were protected. When he noticed Rebecca among the gathered neighbors, his recognition was immediate and unmistakable. "Captain Rodriguez," he called out, crossing the street with obvious respect and familiarity. "I didn't realize you were personally involved in this case." Rebecca's response revealed the professional relationship that had been hidden throughout this entire investigation. "Lieutenant, I've been working this fraud case as lead consultant for the County Fraud Division." Lieutenant Morrison's reaction to learning that Rebecca lived in the affected neighborhood was immediate and profound. He stopped directly in front of her, came to full attention, and rendered a crisp military-style salute that commanded the attention of everyone present. "Ma'am, it's an honor to work with you again. This investigation represents outstanding work under incredibly challenging circumstances." The salute wasn't just professional courtesy. It was recognition between law enforcement colleagues, acknowledgement of expertise, and respect for someone who had sacrificed personal privacy to protect vulnerable community members from systematic criminal exploitation. The silence that followed Morrison's salute was absolute and electric. Over 100 neighbors, 25,000 live-stream viewers, news crews from multiple stations, and various law enforcement personnel all witnessed the moment when my wife's true identity was revealed through unmistakable professional recognition. The explosion of shocked whispers, gasped exclamations, and redirected cell phone cameras was immediate and overwhelming. "Captain!" Mrs. Parker exclaimed, her voice carrying across the suddenly charged crowd. "She's a police captain?" People were frantically texting, calling friends and family, and demanding explanations for what they'd just witnessed. Morrison's explanation to the gathered crowd provided context that transformed everything neighbors thought they'd understood about the past year's events. "Captain Rodriguez has one of the highest fraud case closure rates in the state," he announced to the assembled residents. "Nancy Moore picked the wrong neighborhood to run her criminal enterprise. The captain has been protecting you long before most of you realized you needed protection." His words reframed every interaction we'd witnessed between Rebecca and Nancy, Every moment of Rebecca's unshakable confidence, every instance of her mysterious knowledge about legal procedures and law enforcement protocols. Rebecca handled the revelation with characteristic professional grace, but I could see the slight tension in her shoulders as she acknowledged the crowd's shocked reactions and barrage of questions. "I'm retired from active duty and work as a fraud consultant now," she explained to neighbors who were struggling to reconcile the woman they'd known with the law enforcement professional being honored by her colleagues. "My job is to help investigate cases like the one that affected our community." Nancy's scheme wasn't isolated to our neighborhood. It was part of a broader pattern of HOA fraud that we've been tracking across multiple jurisdictions. The community's reaction evolved rapidly from shock to something approaching celebration as people realized that justice wasn't just being served, it was being delivered by someone who'd been living among them, protecting them without seeking recognition or personal credit. Neighbors who had been victimized by Nancy's harassment began approaching Rebecca with thanks and questions about the investigation process. Mrs. Parker was particularly emotional, grasping Rebecca's hands and saying, "You saved my home. If you hadn't been here, I never would have had the courage to report what Nancy was doing to me." My own reaction to witnessing Rebecca's professional recognition was complex and overwhelming. Pride in being married to someone whose expertise had dismantled a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Relief that the mysterious aspects of her behavior finally made complete sense. Grateful that she'd chosen to protect our community despite the personal and professional risks involved. But underneath all those emotions was a deeper realization about the woman I'd married. She wasn't just someone who happened to know about fraud investigation. She was someone whose entire career had been built around protecting vulnerable people from predatory authority figures. The media attention that followed Morrison's public recognition of Rebecca's role transformed our neighborhood story into national news about HOA corruption and the law enforcement professionals working to combat it. Reporters interviewing neighbors captured genuine emotions about living under Nancy's systematic harassment and the relief of discovering that someone with real authority had been working to stop it. The footage of Morrison's salute became symbolic of respect for public servants who sacrifice personal privacy to protect communities from hidden criminal enterprises operating under legitimate-seeming authority structures. As law enforcement personnel completed evidence collection and witness interviews, Rebecca coordinated victim services to ensure that everyone affected by Nancy's scheme would receive appropriate support throughout the prosecution process. She explained legal procedures, connected families with advocacy resources, and ensured that elderly and immigrant residents understood their rights as crime victims. Watching her manage these complex logistics while maintaining sensitivity to community trauma demonstrated why Morrison had shown such professional respect. This wasn't just successful case closure, it was exemplary victim-centered law enforcement. The transformation of community dynamics following Rebecca's identity revelation was immediate and profound. Neighbors who had been suspicious of her knowledge and confidence now understood that her expertise came from decades of professional experience protecting people exactly like them. The mystery phone calls, government vehicle, and careful responses to questions about her work all made perfect sense once people understood they'd been living next door to someone whose job was investigating the exact type of crimes Nancy had been committing against them. As the lieutenant's salute faded and the community erupted in shocked whispers, I caught Rebecca's eye across the crowd. She was watching me with an expression I'd never seen. Vulnerable, hopeful, terrified. 25,000 viewers were witnessing this moment, but only I could answer the question that mattered most. Now that he knew who she really is, does he still know who they are? Tell us in the comments, would you be proud or scared to discover your partner had this kind of secret? How would you react in Dylan's shoes? The courtroom where Nancy received her sentence was packed with victims, neighbors, and reporters who'd followed our story from social media drama to federal fraud case. Judge Morgan didn't mince words when she handed down 2 years in county jail, plus $200,000 in restitution, with additional civil penalties that would keep Nancy paying victims for decades. "Miss Moore," the judge said, "you systematically exploited your position of trust to defraud vulnerable residents. Your actions destroyed families, forced elderly citizens from their homes, and corrupted the very concept of community governance." Nancy's final statement to the court was a rambling justification about protecting property values and maintaining community standards, proving she still didn't understand that theft is theft, regardless of how you dress it up in official-sounding language. Moore Property Solutions was permanently dissolved, its assets liquidated through a process that felt like watching justice work exactly as it should. Every family victimized by Nancy's scheme received full restitution, plus additional damages for emotional distress and harassment. Mrs. Parker not only recovered her $3,000, but received compensation that allowed her to make long overdue home improvements without fear of manufactured violations. The immigrant families who'd been terrorized into paying thousands for non-existent infractions used their settlements to establish emergency funds, protecting themselves against future predatory schemes. 3 families who had been forced to sell their homes at below-market prices chose to return to our neighborhood, purchasing properties at fair values in a community now protected by transparent governance. Rebecca's professional recognition came through multiple channels, each acknowledging different aspects of her contribution to exposing systematic HOA fraud. The county presented her with their highest civilian honor for fraud prevention, while the state attorney general cited her work in testimony supporting new legislation to protect homeowners from association abuse. But the recognition that mattered most to our community was Rebecca's unanimous election as HOA president, chosen by neighbors who finally understood exactly who had been protecting them during Nancy's reign of terror. Her acceptance speech was characteristically modest. Community governance should serve residents, not exploit them. Transparency isn't just good policy, it's the foundation of trust. Rebecca's first act as HOA president established precedents that transformed our neighborhood from a place of fear into a genuine community. All meetings would be live-streamed with recordings publicly archived, all financial records made available through a searchable online database, and all major decisions subject to democratic voting by homeowners rather than board decree. She established a victim advocacy program connecting residents with legal resources and support services, ensuring that anyone facing harassment would have immediate access to professional help. Most importantly, she created educational workshops teaching homeowners their legal rights, empowering residents to recognize and resist future attempts at exploitation or abuse. The regulatory changes that emerged from Rebecca's case had implications far beyond our neighborhood, creating new protections for homeowners throughout the state. Legislation requiring public disclosure of HOA financial records meant that schemes like Nancy's could be detected early through community oversight. Mandatory mediation before fine enforcement prevented boards from using financial threats to coerce immediate compliance with questionable violations. Criminal penalties for board members who abused their authority for personal gain meant that future Nancy Moores would face serious consequences for exploiting their positions of trust. Rebecca testified before state legislators about these reforms, her expertise grounded in direct experience with how corruption destroys communities. 6 months after Nancy's sentencing, I painted our front door the most electric blue I could find, and instead of complaints, 3 neighbors followed suit with equally vibrant colors that created an unofficial rainbow of individual expression. Mrs. Parker installed an elaborate garden gnome collection that would have triggered thousands in fines under Nancy's regime, while the family across the street added decorative shutters in purple that definitely weren't in any HOA color palette ever created. Our neighborhood became a celebration of personal choice within reasonable community standards, proving that aesthetic diversity could coexist with property value maintenance when governance focused on genuine community benefit rather than control and exploitation. Rebecca's consulting business grew beyond HOA reform to encompass broader community governance issues, helping municipalities and associations across multiple states identify and address corruption before it escalated to criminal activity. She travels frequently now, but our relationship is stronger because I understand exactly where she's going and why her work matters to families like ours. Sometimes I accompany her to cases, providing perspective on how governance failures affect ordinary residents who simply want to live peacefully in their homes. We've become genuine partners in work that extends far beyond our personal experience, united by a shared commitment to protecting communities from predatory leadership. The documentary filmmakers who optioned our story for streaming release captured something important about the nature of corruption and the people who fight it. Nancy wasn't a cartoon villain, but an intelligent person who weaponized legitimate authority structures to commit sophisticated crimes against vulnerable populations. She succeeded for years because most residents assumed HOA board members were honest volunteers working for community benefit, not criminals running systematic fraud operations. Her victims stayed silent because they believed they had no recourse against official community policies, even when those policies were actually illegal extortion schemes disguised as property management. Rebecca's success in stopping Nancy came not just from professional expertise, but from a genuine commitment to community protection that required sacrificing personal privacy and risking professional relationships. The investigation demanded months of careful evidence gathering, victim coordination, and collaboration with multiple law enforcement agencies while maintaining operational security that prevented Nancy from destroying evidence or intimidating witnesses. Every aspect of the case required balancing legal requirements with community needs, ensuring that justice was served to victims while preventing future crimes against other neighborhoods. 1 year after Nancy's arrest, our neighborhood hosted its inaugural Transparency Day celebration, featuring a block party where residents shared experiences and celebrated the transformation of community governance from authoritarian control to democratic participation. Local media covered the event, interviewing families about the difference between living under systematic harassment and participating in genuine community leadership. Children who'd been afraid to play in their yards because of noise complaints were organizing neighborhood games, while elderly residents previously isolated by fear were participating in gardening projects and social activities that strengthened community bonds. The national attention our case received led to Rebecca speaking at law enforcement conferences about recognizing and investigating abuse of authority in community settings. Police academies now include training on HOA fraud detection, while business schools examine how more property solutions manipulated official procedures to disguise criminal activity as legitimate community service. Legal advocacy organizations use Nancy's prosecution as a template for pursuing similar cases, providing resources that help other victims navigate complex jurisdictional issues when reporting systematic fraud by community associations. The most meaningful outcome of this entire experience has been connecting with families in other communities who faced similar harassment and felt powerless to resist. Through Rebecca's consulting work and my documentation of our experience, we've helped expose corrupt boards in dozens of neighborhoods, preventing hundreds of families from experiencing the financial and emotional trauma that Nancy inflicted on our community. Every case reinforces the lesson that corruption thrives in silence and darkness, while transparency and community engagement provide the strongest protection against predatory leadership. As I finish documenting this story, I want people to understand something crucial about the nature of justice and community protection. Sometimes the person who seems most suspicious is actually protecting everyone else. Sometimes justice wears a badge, carries secrets, and just wants to paint her door blue. And sometimes standing up to a bully changes not just your own life, but transforms an entire community forever. The difference between corruption and good governance isn't complexity, it's transparency, accountability, and genuine commitment to serving the people you're supposed to protect. That's the kind of story we love sharing here at Echo Stories. Real people facing impossible situations and finding the courage to fight back. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.